I'm a park ranger here in the Northern Cascades. I frequently respond to emergencies, search and rescue, and also do some law enforcement work myself. This summer, I was working on a trail crew about 20 miles from the Hoosman campground. I dropped back a few hundred yards from the crew to relieve myself, and I noticed a large, sickly sweet odor in the air. It kind of smelled like bear feces, but it was different. As I stood there, I heard crunching twigs from down the trail, and that's when I saw this large, dark figure walking upright in my direction. I turned and began to hide behind a tree. As I turned back to look, it was maybe only about 10 feet away. It was black, a bit shorter than I. No visible neck that I could see. It stopped at the tree I was hiding behind, sniffing the air with its nose pointing up. I could not see any visible eyes. I was rooted to the spot in fear and could not physically move a muscle. It then turned around, walked away casually in the same manner it had arrived. I stood there for a few more minutes to see if it would circle back around, and then ran back to my crew. I refused to tell anybody what I had seen. I hope nobody has to experience such a thing. I wandered over to the other side of your website and came across a whole bunch of info on missing people, park ranger stories, and much more. Well, I'm a park ranger myself at the Grand Canyon. I've been a few years now and have asked about the most bizarre disappearances. I have had 2 Class 2 missing persons, one from the South Rim in 2012 and another from the North Rim this year. Both were found dead as a result of drowning. There were other peculiar incidents in the past several years, including an employee that had a fatal heart attack in a remote part of the park. It is no joke. There is something strange going on about the park and the amount of missing persons, not just here, but everywhere, and strange deaths. Coyote Buttes, the area north of the canyon, is especially creepy. It's where the last 2 disappearances were, the 2012 one and this year's missing person. There's a strong rumor of a skinwalker being in the area, which is not far from a nearby reservation. Legends have always been particularly bizarre. I'm very eager to hear your thoughts on this matter. I work for a city park and recreation department here in Colorado. I also serve as a district ranger for the National Park Service. I took the ranger patrolling training and love the outdoors, but I'm not a trained scientist or a tracker. I was driving home from work one evening in 2017, and it was dusk. I was heading east on US 24 towards Berthoud Falls. There is a turnoff located before you get right to the falls that goes to a park where you can camp called Rainbow Park. I was driving down the turnoff, and when I reached the bottom of the road, I saw this huge thing looking at me. I wasn't sure what it was at first, but I really thought it was a bear. But then I saw wings, and saw that this might be some sort of mountain lion creature with wings. At least, that's what it looked like. So, I'm thinking it's a flying mountain lion. Totally confused because my brain cannot process this. It does not make any sense. Then, it jumps off the ground and takes off into the air. Not only was this amazing to see, but it was also mind-numbing. It was huge and had a very large body and a wingspan far larger than my truck. The body was more like a mix between a human and a lion, and the head looked more like a large cat. I thought maybe it was injured, or I'm not sure what it was doing. I could see, though, that its wings were very strange, also very alien-looking to any kind of bird we have here on Earth. I mean, these are just my guesses. I took off into the woods, drove up the road to the park, got on my truck, still shocked at my sighting, and everything around me was dead silent. I noticed right away, it was colder than usual, and things did not feel right. I had a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. I just tried to shake it off as best I could, and things seemed to stop for the time being. Later on, I went back to the spot where I had my sighting, and there were huge impressions on the ground where it landed, going through the trees into the woods. I was so confused, but also scared and in awe. I've kept this a secret until now. I would love to tell everybody more about what I saw and where. I wish I could have took photos, but it all happened so fast. As scared as I was, it honestly kind of reminded me of seeing something from Greek mythology come to life, or something along those lines. I don't know what creature looks like that with wings, but man, it was something else entirely. Thank you for taking the time to read this. Hello. I'm writing this email to you because I feel that I'm being followed by something here in the woods up here in Pennsylvania. I'm a park ranger for a state park and the PA Game Commission. I was working one day and something I've never seen before stared me down as I was hiking to a remote campsite. I have never seen a deer act like they did. They were terrified, unlike anything I've seen in behavior. I have seen coyotes and even bear, but this was something different. I've heard the term Dogman before reading this, and after speaking to a fellow Native American friend, he said he had heard of similar creatures. I have to say that the incident, I have been followed a couple of times. I'm only writing this to you because my father said that I will be helped by reaching out to somebody who knows what they're talking about. I have vowed to carry a weapon with me every time I go out, even on personal occasions. If you decide to read this, maybe your audience can offer some advice. I was working in the Redwood National Park at the time, and only worked the night shift. I had never experienced a bear encounter in the park, although I heard people have been seeing them a lot lately. My shift was on a Friday night from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., so I had time to do my thing and catch up on anything. Usually, I carried a radio, a cell phone, and a gun. The radio was a base radio that could reach the visitor center in case of an emergency. The cell phone was specially designed for some communication so I could know who I was talking to. It wasn't exactly a personal cell phone or a work cell phone. It was like a cell phone they give you that has enhanced signal. The thing about being a ranger at night was you can get very lonely, and the visitor center was closed during the day and these hours, so only other rangers were even working in the park. There was a lot of traveling with nobody to talk to. The radio was key to know what the other ranger was doing and if they were nearby. I took my time that evening, doing my rounds and stopping to enjoy the scenery, even at night. It was one of the best perks of the job. Now, the visitor center was located on the west side of the park, and I would have to drive all my way around the west side to start my rounds. To make it to the west side, I would have to travel through the Dipsea Trail, which is a very popular trail for mountain bikers and hikers alike. The trail is open from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. At night, it was very dark and foggy. I only got a radio call a couple of times during my shift, but never did I see another ranger. As I was driving along the Dipsea Trail, the fog was thick and you could not see up the road ahead. As I was traveling about 20 miles an hour, and would use the brake lights of the car to see where I was going at some points, and as I came around the corner, I saw what I thought was a mountain biker standing next to a tree, making note of him. I made a comment out loud about how he should not be here and the trail is closed. As I got closer, I noticed that this person wasn't actually wearing any clothes and was facing the tree. It was maybe about 3 feet away from the fog light of the car, and their back was facing me. I asked out loud several times, and the person did not move. All of my lights were on now. I was now about 10 feet from this person, and I kept asking if they were okay and if they needed help. I began to get scared. I asked again if they needed help, and turned on the siren. I still did not get a response. Something was wrong. I got to about 5 feet away, the tree the person was standing next to. That's when this person just fell over. They were dead, and their face had been carved away. Literally, like with a knife. Think of how a pumpkin is. It was as somebody had burrowed into their skull and the face was gone. I have no idea how it was possible that they were actually standing up and how they managed to fall over. It reminded me of something that would happen to you in a horror movie. But I bailed out of there. And after describing to the other rangers what I saw, They agreed to stay at the station with me, and we'd go back to the trail to check it out. So we all ended up going down there within 10 minutes, the area where I originally saw the person on the trail. But as I got closer to the same spot, now I saw a different figure, a naked woman. I slowed down, and she began looking in my direction. The only issue is I passed right through her, and her eyes began glowing red, right after she passed my vehicle, or should I say walked through my vehicle and then disappeared entirely. Me and the other rangers were pretty scared and freaked out. We weren't exactly sure what to do. We just wanted to come out of the park. We wanted to be done. And, by the way, there was no accounts of that body anymore. As a ranger, I should have called the body in and got for help, but I was so spooked that I couldn't help but leave. This is when we went to retrieve that body that I'm talking about, the one with the burrowed-out face. There were no signs of it, no signs of blood, attack, a murder, anything. Not even a trail or feet marks. It's as if the body just mysteriously disappeared. And then the apparition of the naked woman with glowing eyes. I'm not sure what to think about that. Last I heard, and last any of my colleagues have heard, this trail and park is not haunted. But either way, I'm not sure what to think about it. Maybe it was a demonic encounter. Maybe it was something else. I've been to many training sessions and have seen other rangers have paranormal experiences before. I've thought about telling somebody outside my work circle. I just been very hesitant to. People will probably laugh at me, potentially think I'm crazy. But I witnessed something that I did not understand. It changed me forever because it scared me and proved to me that those things sometimes you see in horror movies are true. I've thought a lot about this over the years, and have finally decided to open up and talk to somebody. So, my sighting details seeing a large bipedal unknown creature. I live in Portland, Oregon, but I work at Mount Rainier National Park as a backcountry ranger. I would like to remain anonymous, so please refrain from including my name. On the night of the 5th of September, 2015, I was driving home from work after a busy day of trail maintenance on the ARA loop. I was about 15 miles east of Paradise at about 1:30 a.m., and I was doing about 50 miles per hour. I was driving on the Lewis River Road. It was a beautiful night, and I was enjoying the drive. I had my headlights on high beam and was watching my mirrors to avoid deer as they frequent this area. And in the past, I've nearly totaled my car in the winter when a large buck jumped out. As I rounded the corner, coming out of the forest, I noticed a large dark figure on the side of the road. Now immediately, I'm on edge, because in my mind, I'm imagining this being a large buck about to jump out in front of my car, and I could not afford at the time to make another car payment. I immediately slam on my brakes, because I wasn't sure what was going to happen. And I realized it was not a deer, because this thing was standing beside a tree on the road shoulder. So I slowed down even more. I began to focus what little eyesight I had on this creature, and I could see that it was very, very large. Probably about 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy long hair that looked very thick and matted. It was hard to tell in the lighting conditions and shadows any real details of the face, but I could tell that it turned to look at me directly, and then stopped and stepped off the road into the field. It was obviously aware of my presence, and did not seem surprised by me. It continued to walk away from the road into the field, lumbering on 2 legs. I'm telling you now, it was not a bear, because it never walked like one. It reminded me of a person on 2 legs the entire time, the comfortability of bipedally walking. It walked for about a minute, maybe a minute and a half, before I could not see it anymore. I was in shock, to say the least. I drove very slowly for a minute, to see if maybe I could see it again, but I eventually lost sight of it. Even though I was in shock, I did not feel too scared. I did not feel threatened. I was just in total awe at what I just saw. It was so huge and very obviously not a bear or a person in a suit. Why would somebody be out here in the middle of nowhere? It also walked very naturally on 2 legs. I went back to the spot the next day and measured a tree it was standing beside. That's how I know it was around 8.5 feet tall. I've been a park ranger for the better half of 8 years now and have never seen anything like this before in my life. I have had other interesting experiences though in the backcountry, but they were mostly while working and related to the environment. People are always throwing around the term Bigfoot, but I have no idea what this was. I'm ignorant. Please excuse me, and thank you for your time. If you can provide any information, that would be most helpful. Thank you again. First, let me just say, I am a former U.S. Park Ranger. I have been assigned to various parks all throughout the USA back in 1991. I was assigned to the Isle Royale National Park in Lake Superior. It was my job to patrol almost 100 miles of backcountry and write reports on the conditions of several trails. I would rotate my patrol route every couple of weeks to avoid getting too familiar with the backcountry and kept myself alert. During the first part of late August, I rotated to the west end of the island to the Greenstone area. The Greenstone is located on the northeastern part of the island. It is like a pile of massive rocks on a point overlooking Lake Greenstone Cove. The area around this point is a well-known spot for the Native Americans for making tools and other items from the Greenstone and for fishing. The area is also reputed to be very haunted, and some of the stories are quite horrifying. This place is covered in very thick spruce forest, and there are only a couple of trails that even cut through. One of the trails is called the Greenstone Shore Trail. It cuts through the forest and is on the shore of the lake. It is a very isolated area, and the only way in or out of the area is by barge or via the Greenstone Shore Trail. So I was patrolling the southern point of the trail when I came across a clearing. I stood there and began to hear a very strange noise. The noise sounded like a long, low moan that changed to a very loud sputtering noise. I stood there and listened for a few more moments and decided that I better go check it out. I walked into the clearing, scanning the area. I could see a series of old fire pits in the area and something dark lying on the ground about 50 feet away. It was heavy. Whatever this was, which I initially thought was a bear, turned out to be on 4 legs. So I took out my binoculars and looked, but couldn't really see any details on the animal. I thought it might be a bear, but its shape was beginning to look too big. I stood there for a while, as it was still sputtering and moaning, and keep in mind it was kind of tucked away in tall grass. I began to believe that maybe this was a sick or injured bear or animal, so I ventured around to see if I can get a better view by getting closer to it without directly in its line of sight. When I did, the animal disappeared entirely, but the groaning sounds stayed. There's no way something this large could have gotten up and disappeared from my sight that easily. Something was off. I could feel it. After it disappeared, the woods around me went completely silent, and I had this creeping feeling in my stomach that I needed to leave now, that I was in imminent danger. And then, the horrifying thought raced through my brain. What if it was a ploy? What if I was dealing with a large predator, and that was just a way to lure me into the open where I'd be more vulnerable? As these thoughts went through my head, I did not think rationally or clearly. I just got out of the area and did my best to quench my emotions. Now, 2 days after the incident in question, I was in the ranger station, filling out reports, and the dispatcher began yelling for me to come over the radio. It was a message from the Greenstone Ranger Station. There had been an accident a couple miles north of the Greenstone Station. They required my assistance. I got on the boat and headed over there. I met 2 other boats from the station, and we headed to where the accident occurred. Apparently, 4 people in the accident who were injured were being chased by some large black animal that they were convinced was Bigfoot. They explained that it had a large snout, huge teeth, and large claws. We took their statements. They were so scared and shaken up, they had an accident by getting into their boat, smacking it into each other. Fortunately, They're all okay with only minor injuries. But the boats, well, that's a different story. I often reflect back and wonder if there's any correlation to the large figure I saw in the tall grass there in that meadow and what they described as seeing. From the distance I was at, it was really hard to tell what exactly I was looking at. Even though it resembled a bear, I could tell it was a large animal. But because of how it was laying and how much of its body was truly concealed, there was no way to really know what it was for sure unless I got closer. But the strange groaning and moaning sounds, I'm not sure how to describe it or really write it off or rationalize it. I've heard bears make noise, even deer, dying and injured, but this was different. It was so bassy in tone, and the sound was different. I guess it's safe to say that I'm a little creeped out by the whole thing, and after taking these witnesses' statements, I really don't believe them to be making up stories. They were all visibly shaken. The one man, the bigger, older man, was actually shaking really bad, and he almost had tears in his eyes, as we were all detailing the same story. Even though this was many years ago now, it sticks with me, just like it happened last week. I've spent 20 years in park and recreational management, currently serving in the National Park Service as a superintendent. I've seen and heard many strange things while working in the backcountry. This email is to report an encounter I had with a cat thing while in the backcountry. This occurred during the winter of 2010 and going into 2011. It was in the early afternoon. I left the ranger cabin and traveled 4.5 miles up the trail to a backcountry emergency shelter. This shelter is a replacement of the original shelter, which burned down in the late 1980s. It had been seen by many uses, but the last 6 years especially, I had really been the only person to stay there. I arrived at the shelter by 4 p.m. and immediately got my gear outside. I was working on my snowshoes when I heard a distant bellowing howl. It was a howl that I had never heard before. I am very well versed in all the howls of wolf, coyotes, and other animals, but this was different. Way different. It was much deeper, had a lot more growl and distortion to the timbre. It was definitely not a wolf, elk, bear, or any mammal that I'm familiar with, for the matter. The noise was a bellow howl that went for about a minute, with a slight pause between the bellows and howls. It was a very, very strong howl. But also, as terrified as I was by hearing this, I was curious. I grabbed my pack and my snowshoes and began walking toward the source of the vocalization. I walked about 3/4 a mile to a large rise on the ridgeline. As I walked towards the ridge, that's when I began to notice several deer carcasses. Deer, by the way, are abundant in the area. I see them all the time. We actually have several types, but the most common is whitetail. I immediately thought something was hunting them. Upon closer inspection, the 3 visible carcasses I've seen were very horribly mutilated. What's also more strange is that the corpses were not eaten on. They were just ripped up. The doe, the closest one that I was to, had her neck ripped open and her head was missing. Something visibly tore this animal's head off, but there were no bite marks or claw marks on the animal. It just seemed like a brutal kill. Something wasn't right. As that thought is in my head, I hear and notice the bellow/howl again, and this time it appeared more powerful and closer. I decided to get up the ridge and see if I could see what was responsible, assuming that the bellowing and howling was the creature responsible. I quickly moved up the ridge, but as I neared the top, the bellows and howls happened again, only this time, they were getting even closer. I approached the ridge top and heard the noise coming from a small meadow. As I looked across the small meadow, I noticed this creature. It was standing on the other side of the ridge top. It was this strange-looking thing. I call it a cat, because that's the closest that it resembled, but it was far too distorted, far too different. It was much more like if you mixed a person or a human being with a lion and a mountain lion. I very visibly remember the brindle coloring and the mane around its neck. It was definitely larger than a mountain lion. The animal was facing my direction, but at about a 45-degree angle. I could see its front quarters very well. As I watched it, staring at it intently, it never appeared to move, and the sound it was making completely stopped. And the entire time I was staring at it, I was trying to process what animal am I seeing, but I could not make it out. It was on all fours and looked very, very strange. I want to say I was probably there for 5 minutes, but in actuality, I was probably only staring at it for maybe 30 seconds, 45 at most. The thought had occurred to me that I better leave now, before whatever this giant cat is notices me and decides to make me its next meal, or do what it did to me like it did to the deer. Now, as I'm going down the ridgeline, I could hear something coming up the hill behind. I turned around and looked up the trail. There were 2 deer running. When I turned back down, I could see the cat now, moving in my direction. So I walked quickly to the far edge of the ridge and saw this thing now walking about 75 yards. As it walked up the hill, it would stop every few steps and look back at me. It continued this walking-looking behavior until it was completely out of sight far over the ridgeline. I stayed there for about 5 minutes, and I never heard it bellow or howl again after that. I very hastily walked back down the hill, packed up my gear, and began my 6-mile walk back all the way around the cabin, the long way. I've never seen this creature again, and I think it's safe to presume that this was the creature's territory, and it was hunting the deer, because the portion of backcountry I was on, that entire ridgeline, is very untouched. It was a portion even I'm very unfamiliar with. As the years have gone on, I've told a few friends and colleagues. They're convinced I just saw a mountain lion from far away, but if it really was a mountain lion, we're talking about a severely deformed mountain lion. I know what mountain lions look like. This was not it. I have seen many mountain lions in my career. I do think it was hunting the deer on the ridgeline, and possibly I irritated it. I've also come across several other eyewitness stories similar to mine, describing a creature very similar in the National Park Service, but have never come across any real concrete evidence of its existence, other than my one eyewitness story that I have myself. This is why I'm sending you my email. I've never heard of any cryptid sightings in the Smokies, but I have seen and heard of several unexplained phenomenon. Several of my coworkers have also at different times witnessed strange lights over the mountains at nighttime. In fact, there was one instance where a park ranger, a friend of mine, and his girlfriend saw a UFO over the park. I myself have never seen such a thing, but I take his word for it. He's an older gentleman, single, not married, and has no reason to fabricate any story, nor is he much of a storyteller or a jokester. He's also very, very serious, especially when he tells that story. He went into more detail and described it like a large black triangle craft that kind of hovered over the park and then just faded out, as in it just went translucent and disappeared. I know there's a lot of weird stuff that occurs out here, my sighting and experience included. Keep up the good work. I work as a seasonal park ranger here at Lassen National Park in California. I recently rediscovered your YouTube channel. I had forgotten it a long time ago. You might remember me. I was the individual who contacted you via email while I was a student at Sacramento State. I wanted to let you know that Lassen National Park, we've had a lot of strange sightings, including a supposed mountain goat, wolf-like creature. We've also had more than one eyewitness reported of a thing that had all the physical characteristics of a Bigfoot, except it walked on all fours and was very, very ugly with a flat human face. In fact, one such sightings included my brother and I. We are both rangers, and at the time, we're also too working seasonally. One Friday afternoon, my brother and I, who were working together, came across a pile of scat, of what we thought was a goat. But we knew it was not mountain goat feces. It looked different. We've seen mountain goats around here before, and the scat was much larger, and was darker in color. It appeared fresh and still kind of wet. We have no idea what this could have been. There are no other animals in the park that produce scat this large. We also have had people report to us that there is a massive black wolf in the park that's twice the size of a regular wolf. People have claimed that it had red eyes and was the size of a large Great Dane. This, of course, has still been unconfirmed. I've seen a lot of strange things in the park myself that I have no explanation for what they could be. There was even a woman that had reported, saying what she referred to as Goat Man, but after going on a search, we could not find anything. Of course, as weird as it is, when we go looking for these things, the woods always seems to have a way of going quiet and getting this feeling like you're being watched. Now, that might just be my paranoia, but I feel a little more level-headed than letting my paranoia control me like that and just imagining things. I'm not exactly sure what all these sightings are about, and I simply don't believe they are all just simply misidentifications. And speaking of which, there was a gentleman I spoke to about 7 months ago who was over on the east section of the park, and at one point or another was actually attacked by what he describes as a bipedal coyote or wolf. He wasn't sure which. This thing actually tore a side in his tent during the nighttime while he was sleeping and attacked him. It tore his arm pretty well, and fortunately, he did not have to lose his arm, and they were able to save it. But he shot this thing right in the face multiple times until it finally fled. He said, had he not been heavily armed with his Glock, he has no idea what would have happened. He probably would not be alive. He said this creature looked evil and was very, very big. But he kept saying coyote more than he did wolf, and said it looked very human in the way its eyes looked. Not in a literal sense, he described, but the intelligence, the intent behind what it was doing. He described it as if it was wanting to not only hurt him, but know that it wanted to hurt him. This, simply put, it was just evil. Now, me personally, I have no way to explain that away. But I figured that you enjoy reports like that, so that's why I'm bringing it to your attention. I know there are a lot of weird things out here in the national parks, especially here in the state of California, judging by that episode you posted about a month or two back about all the California horror stories, which I find very intriguing to say the least. Anyway, I have no explanations of anything that I found or experienced. Maybe you do. This is a strange one. A little over a year ago, back in 2018, in the Grand Teton National Park, I had an encounter with a creature that I simply cannot identify. I have searched and scoured online and have not found anything that resembles the being that I saw. I try not to speak of this often, as fear I will be thought of as a loon. During the summer of 2018, I was working for the National Park Service here in the Grand Teton National Park in the Inner Lakes District. This was my first year in the position. I was working at a campground, specifically on Blacktail Butte, just outside the main park. I was busy closing the campground and had 2 other coworkers there with me. As I was counting the money from the evening before, I heard a very distinct but strange, unmistakable howl to the west of the campground. The sound seemed to be coming from the base of the mountain. The campground is located at the base of Blacktail Butte, which is a very small mountain just on the outskirts of the park. I could see from my location that the sound was coming from the direction of the mountain. There were 3 other campgrounds also located near the mountain, so I could see all the other campers and employees in the area for the most part. There were no campers with their dogs in their campsites, so that was checked off. Nor were there any dogs visible. I was trying to determine what this howl was, or if maybe there was a wolf. But the howl was unlike a coyote or a wolf. It was very different. As I was listening, I heard a second howl, similar but not exactly the same. I have never heard a coyote or a wolf make a sound as this. It's hard to describe really, but it was similar to the recording of the Bigfoot calls that you can hear online. Off the top of my head, I want to say they are the Ohio calls. You could look it up, I'm sure it's on YouTube, as is everything anymore. But I continued to listen, and as I did, all of the other rangers in and around the area also did too. I began to ask the other coworkers if they had heard the sound, but apparently nobody had heard the sound from their location. I felt silly, so I kept my mouth shut. After a few moments, I heard a very loud howl in the same location as the previous two, but this one was closer. I again asked everybody if they had heard it. Almost instantly, they were acting strange and told me no, they had not. They were acting nervous and quick-eyed. Something tells me that they had heard it and were just not wanting to say anything. What did they know that I did not? And just as I was almost ready to pack up and leave, I heard a coworker on the radio, calling with him for a minute. As I was leaving, I could see a person walking in the area of the howl, staying in the tree line but moving steadily up the mountain. I got closer, asking my coworker if he had seen anybody in the area, as he had told me that he too had been walking around and patrolling the area. I informed him that the sounds that I had heard, I was not sure what they were, but they were coming from the back part of the campground. He got nervous almost instantly the second I brought them up. He got close to me and whispered in my ear that he's pretty sure he saw a tall, dark figure moving around on the back section of the park, but says he did not get a good look at them and claims he did not want to, that he felt immediate danger and fear. Now, as he's speaking with me, I could tell from his voice and apparent body language that he was concerned, to put it mildly. I drove a little bit further, trying to see what it was that he was seeing. He had told me it was on the back section of the park, and that is exactly where I went. After a little while, I'm pretty sure that I saw what it was he saw, because what I saw was approximately 7 feet tall and had the same dark color. I tried to get a better look at it, but I could tell it was right near the edge of the tree line. It had already moved into the tree line again from coming out of a large meadow. I even told my other rangers, and they would not speak to me about it. In fact, one told me to stop talking about it if I knew what was good for me. This particular ranger has not spoken with me since, and refuses to. After I seen this thing go into the tree line, I decided not to follow it. And another thing to keep in mind is it was actually pouring down rain during this time, and even though the ground was hard, there should have been tracks, because I did go back later on to look, and I did not see any, especially in the wet portion of grass where I saw this thing entering the tree line. It was very strange how I did not find any tracks at all, boot or tracks of animals. After returning back to the office, I kept hearing the howls again almost all night, and this time there were multiples. One coming from the north end of the campground, and the other on the east. My belief is that there was two of these creatures communicating back and forth with each other. So now, if I ever hear or experience anything strange, I don't really talk about it to my colleagues because, for whatever reason, they seem so hellbent on keeping everything a big secret or conspiracy. Something I'm not really sure why, but they refuse to talk about it. Perhaps the refusal of acknowledgement of this existence helps them better in day-to-day life, coping. But for me, I'm trying to get down to the bottom of it. I would also lastly like to assure you that what I saw was simply not a person, nor is it a person in a costume, because what I saw could not be explained. For it to be a person, the proportions were so off and distorted, it would not make sense, and the movement alone was different. I also apologize in advance for not having the most descriptive story and account, but you get what you get. Thank you greatly for taking the time to listen to my story. I'm a ranger in the National Park Service, and am posting this to you from my Facebook. I was flipping through your posts while on lunch break and saw a few paranormal ones and missing 411 ones. I am very experienced and have seen many strange things in these parks, things I cannot explain. I've yet to see anything deemed paranormal or even supernatural. In my 20 years of experience, I have seen a number of strange things though. Many of them I can't explain. but I always have to be careful of what I label them as, and specifically, on paper, that they are natural occurrences, if you understand what I'm saying. My husband is also a park ranger, and he has seen more than I have, and has witnessed more things than he can explain. Currently, I'm on the East Coast, and my husband is on the West. We have parks in common, and we have parks that are different. I'm also kind of a park naturalist, and have been in many places in the parks that most people have not gone to. The thing that struck me the most is that I could not explain was when I worked at Canyonlands NP. I was working at the island in the Sky Visitor Center. It was around the time when Canyonlands National Park was getting a lot of attention due to the status as a dark sky sanctuary. I had many people from the public come and ask me questions about how to see the night sky. One couple came in and spent quite some time talking about the stars and planets. The man of the couple, probably around 30 years of age, left for a moment to go to the bathroom. His girlfriend asked, "Are we close to a Skinwalker ranch?" I was quite taken aback and replied, "We are quite a distance away, probably over an hour's drive." They told me, "That's a good thing because they are not what they say they are." I asked her, "What are they?" And she said they were stalking, manipulative, dangerous creatures, but she could not tell me much more. She acted very strange and very fidgety, almost like a drug addict would while they were fiending. It was very strange behavior, but I doubt she was on drugs, because she was very coherent. And even though what she was saying was creepy, it wasn't exactly drug talk. We spoke for a few more minutes, then her boyfriend returned and they left. I still wonder about that encounter and what she meant. It sounded like she knew something. I've often thought about it. I would love to know more about what she knew about them specifically, but I attribute that encounter to a different thing altogether. Again, I've been doing this job for well over 20 years, and while I've had some strange experiences like that, I've never exactly seen a ghost or some sort of demon. Before I end this email, I'll tell you about one more story that I have. So, this is around the same time. I was working night and actually walking back to one of my vehicles. Not my personal vehicle, by the way. And maybe about 35 yards into the woods, I heard my name being called by a voice that sounds very familiar. I could not quite put my finger on who it was, but I knew the voice from somewhere. But they were very softly calling my name from in the woods. Immediately, this struck every wrong chord in my body, because I knew that whoever this person was did not mean well, if you catch my drift. And how do they know my name? They were clearly stalking me. Everything about the situation was bad. I called out to them, showing my light and my gun, demanding they show themselves. I realized, once I stopped talking, just how quiet the night was. Even the crickets had ceased their noise making. I quickly backed my way to my vehicle and drove out of there. I don't know what that was or who that was, but I'm glad I did not find out. I wanted to pass this along to you. I saw this post specifically on Facebook and kind of wanted to share and talk to you. See, I work as a ranger here in Arizona, and I went backpacking to the Grand Canyon this past October. I put on the most conservative clothes I could, thinking I would blend into the landscape the best. I did not even shave for 3 days. Kidding, I'm just trying to make it funny, lighten the story. I had a 3-day permit and just hiked into the Grand Canyon, hiking along the southern rim and camping at the bottom. I day hiked back and out at the end of the permit. I did run across more people than I thought I would. Figured I would have better chance of telling my story to people who aren't from around here. So I kept my permit for 3 days, stopping in the El Tovar Hotel for dinner. I decided to sit at the bar and talk to the folks next to me, who happened to be Canadians. I told them I was a ranger and we were talking about the Grand Canyon and backpacking for a little while. Then, one of the guys who I was talking to told me, I had a really strange experience in the canyon a few years ago. I thought to myself, here we go. Okay, I'm going to ask him a bunch of questions, get some more details and write it down in my journal. He went on to say that they went into the Grand Canyon a few years back and were coming out the South Kaibab Trail, bouncing down the trail and enjoying the day, when his friend saw a man running from a fire behind him up the hill, very panicked and frantic. And he said to his friend, and this guy, who was apparently barely clothed and had a very manic, crazy look to his face, went right by them, did not say anything, did not even acknowledge their existence. He said that his friend and him had a very weird feeling and kept moving. There was a river running along the trail, and there was a bridge that goes over the river. They came across the fire department there, putting out a campfire that had grown out of control. They almost wonder if the man that walked past them was the man who started the fire and was retreating. So, as they kept going down the trail, it was now beginning to get dark, about 5 miles. They were also about 6,000 feet. They both saw a huge dark figure standing in front of a rock. It was blocking their way almost. What frightened them the most was lying against a rock. As they made their way down to the bottom, they both described a large dark figure, black skin, huge red eyes, about 9 feet tall and moving on 2 legs, like a man. They just kept moving, trying to stay calm and get to the bottom. Again, it was also very dark, and they had 3 more miles to go. Once they got there to the bottom, they were knocking on the door frantically, and a park ranger came to the door, asking them if everything was okay. They weren't sure if they saw a bear or what, but I guess the ranger was convinced they just saw a large bear, even though they were adamant about what they saw and that it was not a bear or a misidentification, and how terrified and shook they were. I thought you might find their story interesting. They told me they never told anybody about it because they were convinced they were going to be the laughingstock. But they had also told me too, in conversation, they have some friends who are Apache and Navajo, and both admit there's some pretty questionable things going on down in the canyon, even more so at night. It's probably best to stay away. If you want to contact me, feel free to. I just thought this would be interesting to you. I was a ranger, a climbing ranger, out the Allegheny State Park in New York from 2003 to 2008. This park is well known for its free-roaming bison herd and the number of also unsolved murders that occurred there the past 150 years or so. During the 4th of July weekend in 2007, I had an experience that I just could not explain. I was assigned to the eastern side of the park to staff the entrance booth and hiking trails on the other side of Route 98 from the main campground. There was also a designated picnic area that was quite further back in the woods. I drove into the park and parked my Hummer in the parking lot behind the picnic area. After sitting in the vehicle for a few moments, then got out to open the gate that leads to the picnic area. As I was walking back out to my vehicle, I noticed a family of 4 sitting on the table. They were in the process of unpacking their food. I greeted them kindly, opened the gate, and drove up to the booth. I was expecting that I would be the only ranger on duty for the rest of the weekend. I was wrong. I was actually the 3rd ranger assigned there. I arrived a little bit before noon, and 1 ranger had just left. It was a beautiful day, and people were out in droves. I had quite a bit of traffic at one point. I was helping 3 separate groups of people, all with their own issues of some kind. There was a delay in water supply apparently, so I was calling utility companies to try and fix them. I also had to give 2 people different directions since they weren't sure where to go. I'm not sure how long I had been occupied with these tasks, but I was beginning to notice it was getting a little darker than usual earlier. The daylight savings time change had just occurred, and I was getting ready to check the woods on the other side of the picnic area. Then I noticed a car coming down the side of the road. The road was a secondary access and led to a small picnic area and the Allegheny Cemetery, which is quite old. I was surprised to see the car come out of nowhere, so I got back behind the booth and watched. It drove up to the area and stopped. I was puzzled because I thought the area was closed. The driver and the passenger got out, looked around, and got back into the vehicle very suspiciously. They drove out of the area and out of sight. I immediately went to the booth and found the key to the radio and carried with us. I called the on-call ranger and told him about the incident, and the two seemed very sketchy, like they were looking for something. I also told him about the other rangers assigned to the area. He said there was nothing he could do until their shift ended at around 8 p.m. I watched the road for a little while longer, and noticed the light was now getting dimmer. I decided to check out the woods to the west of the picnic area. The area was quite hard to access and required some bushwhacking. As I walked along the natural trail, I noticed now that most of the light was gone. I stopped and looked around, noticed it had now become very quiet, just about no sounds whatsoever. I began to walk more quickly. I had a bad feeling about being out there, alone. As I was making my way along the trail, I heard something walking towards me. I stopped and listened. I swear that I could hear breathing. I was scared, but somehow managed to get out my flashlight and turn it on. The beam of light illuminated the area in front of me, and I finally saw what was standing about 15 feet in front of me. The thing was 7 to 8 feet tall, made from a combination of fur and skin. It looked like a mixture of bear and a human. I raised the radio to my mouth to call the on-call ranger again when it let out the most terrifying growl that I have ever heard. It raised its right arm and lunged at me, but I turned and ran as fast as I could down the trail. I knew that I only had about a quarter mile to go before I would reach the open meadow area. I was trying my hardest not to look back, but did so and saw the thing was keeping up with me with ease. I kept telling myself that it was just an animal, and there was nothing supernatural about it, but that did not work. As I reached the open meadow, I tripped on a fallen log and went down. I was trying to get up and run when I heard it coming. A shot rang out, and I could hear the cracking of twigs and branches. Then, the on-call ranger appeared and told me to stay down. The thing was circling us, but it would not approach any closer. The ranger fired 2 more shots. We could hear the thing running away. He helped me up and walked me back to the booth. I injured my knee during the fall, but did not want to see any medical help. We had a mutual agreement together to keep quiet about this and to not tell our supervisors or anybody else we know. We have no idea what kind of professional retribution there would be, or potentially career suicide. Since all this, I've moved to Georgia, and I now work for a private security firm. I still do a lot of hiking and camping, but never really go off trail, if I can help it. Thanks for your time. It was on a hot summer night that I was out in the dark woods with my neighbor, whom I'm pretty close with. He was like extended family, honestly. The fact that I didn't even know we were going until that night when I was sitting at home in front of my laptop, playing video games. My neighbor came over to see me, and he asked me if I wanted to go camping with him and his family. It had been a while since we last did anything together, so of course I said yes. It would have just given us an excuse not to go to school for a couple of days. This was in September, so school had just started back up, and the coldness of fall had not yet come, so it was perfect. The next day, his family and I gathered our camping gear. We're driving down a dark road with tall trees on either side of it. It was getting dark quickly, so we had to turn the lights on, and unfortunately, which means we would have had to set up in the dark. So we're driving for about an hour or 2, but it felt like it took forever. My friend's dad turned left at an unmarked intersection, where there wasn't even a sign saying that this was the right turnoff. The road got bumpy and rocky as he drove over this very raw, unpaved road. That's when we came across a large clearing, because all I could see around me was trees and darkness, where we stopped at this makeshift campground. I say that because there was no clear indicated spot to set up a tent, a spigot, a bathroom, or anything. This was truly camping just out in the middle of nowhere. Perfect. Now, I need to say that it was pitch black out, and it had gotten really cold now that the sun had set. We were also higher up in elevation, so we got everything set up quickly, and decided we would huddle up in the tent together that my friend's father had set up for us. But I just had this feeling lingering within me that we weren't alone. Now, my brain was playing tricks on me, so I decided to step out and get some fresh air. It was eerily quiet until I heard this screaming noise. My heart began pounding fast, as if it knew what was coming. Then we heard a rustling noise in the bushes, more screaming from the woods. I was so scared that my friend told me to come back into the tent now. Not only could we all hear the noises, but then, as I got back in the tent and we shined our light, we could see something moving outside the tent. This shape. My friend's dad got a flashlight, shining it too at this object. That's when this thing began screaming and thrashing. Now we're all yelling, freaking out because we can see the shape of this thing more. It looked like an animal, but all we could see was this large shape, and it was terrifying looking. From the silhouette, it looked like an upright, deformed reindeer or something, and it had long claws. Were we being pranked? I wasn't even sure. It screamed again in our direction, and we just prayed for it to leave. It walked around our tent, and we all kept our flashlights shining at it through the tent material, only revealing its silhouette. But one thing I noticed is it never came closer to the tent. It's like it was pissed that we set up camp here in its area. I get it. This probably sounds like some sort of amateur creepypasta, but tell that to my family, my friend's family, and me, who have to deal with the memory of this thing. We stopped hearing it, almost literally, after we all pretty much urinated all over our sleeping bags out of terror. Surprisingly, none of us had any weapons on us. Somehow we all forgot. We got lucky that night, but who knows what would have happened if it were to come back, and possibly check out our tent. Now, of course, my friend's dad regrets that he didn't bring any weapons. He forgot. He normally always carries a pistol. I went home the next day, and we didn't get any sleep that night. What was designed to be a several-day trip turned into a quick overnight terror. I've not been able to go camping since. I don't think I ever will. And I'm also not sure what this thing was or where it came out of. I haven't really sat down to try and research either. I don't really care. I just want to get rid of this memory. I had been working as a forest ranger for almost 5 years. A ranger's day could consist of anything from collecting firewood to tracking down missing hikers. And my day began like most. I would wake up early, walking into work, grabbing my binoculars. As I was about to drive out of the forest, I got a call. That day, I was given a new assignment. I met up with another colleague, a fellow ranger, and we went to the center of this area where somebody had been reporting hearing strange screaming coming from around a cave system nearby. My partner and me decided that I would be able to handle it by myself. He had other things to do, and this was just another run-of-the-mill investigation for me. After he left, I headed towards that area where there had been several unreported mounds to this cave system. Now, let me give you some information. This cave system runs pretty deep, and there are guided tours, but I also know that this cave system is very expansive, and also having a lot of unidentified entrances and holes that can lead deeper into the system. These are also off trail, so myself, I've never actually experienced finding more of these, although I know hikers have reported finding many, and even leaving makeshift markers to let other hikers know this was an entrance. Parts of the ground here were also dangerous, meaning if you step on the wrong part, the ground below you could collapse, falling into a tunnel. So I had to be very careful about how I approached this entire search. The good news is, I wasn't hearing any screaming, so that could be good or bad news. The bad news meaning the hiker, or whoever was stuck there, could have been deceased or what. But the good news being that maybe the hiker had gotten themselves out. Anyway, my heart was pounding just by the sheer adrenaline of it. I didn't know why, but something told me to run. It was this feeling in the pit of my gut. As soon as I got there, right around the cavern system, the wind picked up, and everything seemed colder than it already was. A gust. Now, I could have begun my investigation in the main entrance, but as I was planning, I heard the scream. It sounded like a person, but they were maybe a couple 100 feet away, north. So I marched through the trees, looking, following the source of the screaming, yelling out, "Can you hear me? Can you respond?" And the screaming ceased. I followed along the rock wall and found this crude hole in the ground, maybe no larger than 5 feet. It was right by a rotted tree stump with only one branch on it. This, I knew, probably went down into one of the cave systems. This, by the way, was probably no more than 200 feet away from the main entrance. After crouching down, I was able to slide down at a 45-degree angle into this cave system, landing in a small chamber that I think connected to the others. I always carry a flashlight with me, so I took it out and turned it on. As soon as I did that, the caves plunged into darkness as my battery instantly died. That's when I heard a loud crash. I turned around, or I should say, turned to meet the noise, and my flashlight popped back on. There, like out of some sort of sick Stephen King novel, was this grotesque figure, large black eyes covering its entire body, stretching its arms out and moving toward me. And terrified, I wanted to turn and run, but didn't have time, as there was another one of these beings coming from the opposite side of the cave, approaching. I turned as fast as I could and fled up the 45-degree incline about the cave. Just as I was turning to climb up, I could hear a third one approaching from directly behind me. Now I had one coming from my left, my right, and behind me. This one, as I turned and looked, was larger than the other two. Completely terrified out of my mind, and the sounds of screaming were now apparent, coming deeper in the cavern. I don't know if it was an injured hiker, or if these things were making the noise, luring anybody into this tiny crevice, this chamber into the earth. Like I said, the opening to this cavern wasn't large, but I never in a million years would have expected to find things like this. This was horror movie status. I didn't tell anybody else about what I found, and kept it to myself. After climbing out of that hole, I ran, and I ran, and I ran some more. Getting back to the station later on, I didn't say a word. I knew the other rangers wouldn't believe me. And what would I tell them? That I found a cave full of half arachnids, half creatures? I mean, they'd probably think I was crazy. Now, I've kept this secret for a while, but how long can I keep it from the rest of the world? Will my story ever be told to other people, or should I just stay quiet about what had happened? Let me just apologize and say, I'm sorry for the formatting of the story. I'm a terrible writer, and I am not a storyteller, so I'd apologize in advance. But these creatures that I saw were unlike anything I've ever seen. They really reminded me if you crossed a tarantula with a human. I mean, these were gross. They made this hissing, clicking noise too. I know it sounds phony through email, but it's really hard for me to convey emotion properly, at least through written communication. With all the information coming out anymore about missing hikers and seeing strange figures and shapes in the woods, and all the other bizarre happenings of 2020, I figured, hey, maybe now is an okay time to be open about my experiences, and hopefully not experience backlash. I was patrolling my usual forest trails at night. I've been a ranger for 8 years now, and nothing had ever scared me as much as this one experience that I encountered, well, what I think was a Bigfoot, doing my routine patrol on this night. It all started with me walking along the same trail I do at night to do my rounds. Being Florida, it had rained earlier in the day, so everything was calm and peaceful, minus the puddles of mud here and there. The sun had set about an hour or two before, which meant it was exceptionally dark outside, although I was already used to this. The moon was barely out. I saw a few other rangers patrolling with me, but they had passed by, and somewhere out of nowhere, maybe about 30 minutes later, I was walking along the dirt trail when I noticed something appeared in front of me. A dark, large figure coming from the right side of the path and then crossing in front of me as it headed off into some thick brush off to my left. Palmettos, actually. This is directly where I patrol, meaning there should most definitely not be anything even remotely close to resembling whatever this thing was. Its speed is what surprised me and took me off guard, considering it didn't even give me enough time to turn around and see what it looked like. All I could make out was that it was jet black, very tall, and easily taller than I was. It moved quickly. I didn't even have time to react until after it had already gone into the bushes, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared, deep in the palmettos. My heart sunk, and I felt an odd sensation. It was this incredible feeling of fear. All I can think about is how much more dangerous it had just made my job that night. If there was some large animal out here that moved fast, was taller than I and larger than I, that actually crossed paths with me like it did, what else might be lurking out here? Would it cross paths with me again? Was this thing actually looking for me? As I thought about it more, I considered the fact that if something was after me, then maybe whatever it was might be prepared to attack. Although I wasn't going to back down without a fight. I began getting angry. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. But I was a few hours away from my shift ending and talking myself into returning to the station, telling myself that if I did, I would be safe. If this thing is out there, it's just as much looking for me as it is anybody else. So now more than ever, getting to my ranger station was my only priority. I didn't really know what it was or what to think about it, but there was only one way to find out, and that was by continuing my patrol. Now I stood still for a moment, debating with myself on whether or not I should continue. Remembering all the times going back home early had made me feel like a failure. Although I had never encountered anything like this before, it didn't mean there was nothing out there. It only means that whatever it was hadn't bothered me yet. But now that it had crossed paths with me, I might be next on this list of things to kill. That would have made me sick. The rest of my story is pretty uneventful. Unfortunately, after this, not a lot happened. I didn't see the figure again, and as I look back on this event and reflect, I believe I encountered a skunk ape, a Bigfoot, native to the Florida Everglades. While it was probably harmless and didn't want to actually hurt or kill me, it was still completely terrifying. I still don't know if this creature was real or not, but that didn't matter, regardless of what it actually is. I'm convinced that whatever it was, it wanted to hurt me, or so I had convinced myself, and still wonder. I honestly don't know how to explain what had happened to me. I believe I saw some sort of Native American entity. I was working as a ranger for the city of Austin, Texas. I just had one left of our reserve campsites when a very strange thing occurred. This was about 10:30 at night. I was driving my four-wheel drive pickup truck on a dirt road that led back to the entrance of the park. The area is a wooded hillside spanning 200 acres and contains a very large number of wildlife. So, being nighttime and how many animals are nocturnal, I was watching out for signs of their movement on either side of me. It was quiet, and I was the only one around. I had been following the road closely when I got this strong sensation. The road, everything around it, dense woods. I looked up just as a deer ran out in front of my truck, directly in my path. It was something like 40 yards ahead of me. When I saw it, I reacted immediately by pulling onto the shoulder, slamming my brakes. The deer now was only about 10 feet away from my truck when I swerved and it vanished. As soon as it went out of sight, the feeling that had told me to look up subsided. Everything went back to normal. There were no other cars on the road. Of course, being just mine, I sat in place, trying to collect my bearings. My heart was beating fast and I had a headache, and I couldn't explain these feelings. What on earth? So something brought my attention to the hillside, right where the deer had come from. And that's when I saw movement, about 50 yards into the brush. It wasn't clear. I got out of my truck to inspect and walked up to the spot where I thought I had seen the movement through the tree line. The woods were pretty thick, but about 20 feet into them, there was a small opening and trees with lower branches and ones that were not as wide or tall. They almost kind of formed a natural corridor that maybe, I'd say, 50 yards opened up to the hillside before becoming obscured by the other trees and foliage. The ground sloped slightly upward, many leaves. I called out with my flashlight, thinking, why would there be somebody out here? It didn't make any sense. Thinking maybe I was just seeing things, or it might be another deer. There was no answer, and that was it. I assumed it was just my own paranoia. Now, I didn't hear anything move past me, so I decided to inspect further, because why not? Calling out loudly, I knew, at least I'm pretty sure, I saw movement. And again, there should be no reason at all why anybody should be this far out here late at night. The movement I saw was more like a person, not a deer. At least I'm sure of it. So I kind of very shortly walked up the hillside, never hearing a sound. I decided finally that okay, enough is enough. I'm gonna leave and head back to my truck. As soon as I got in, I realized there was something wrong. Something strange and paranormal, if you will. As soon as I got back in my truck is when I saw it. Coming out of the woods ahead of me, slightly up from where the deer emerged, is what I can only unmistakably describe as an apparition. It was this glowing, translucent being, but unmistakably a spirit. It shimmered, seeming to be faint but nearly transparent. It came closer to my truck and appeared as if it were getting bigger, but also darker and more solid at the same time. It was this light grayish color and then would grow darker in color, kind of pulsating. It just walked right past the front of my truck, with no fear or concern about my presence whatsoever. It just walked by like nothing was there, with some kind of purposeful stride, without having so much as even a look of curiosity. And then, right there in my view, it just vanished, fading into obscurity. Not wasting a second, I flew my vehicle out of there, and my only mission in that moment was to go, 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 go. Before this, I thought ghosts were a joke. I had never been a believer in the paranormal, or what many refer to as the spirit realm. But after this, that changed my mind. And I'll never forget what I saw, but it wasn't until the following morning when I really kind of fully mentally processed what I saw. Surprisingly, because I didn't sleep that much. But a thought occurred to me, and I realized what had really happened. What I saw looked like a stereotypical image of a native. Long hair, down to its shoulders. Feathers, a headdress actually, My professional theory is that somebody, a Native American, has gone through this road many times before in their lifetime, and they're simply showing me something that happened here at some point along the way. Maybe they stumbled upon these woods at night, and for whatever reason, they were killed on spot by first contact European settlers, who probably had no qualms about killing anybody different than them, including women and children. I do not believe this entity or spirit to have been malicious. It didn't come off as that. It was just something that happened to them in their lifetime. This spirit was merely doing whatever some non-physical thing does when in the process of trying to relive what happened. It's a possibility that this spot is where these people might have killed or injured in an altercation. Maybe they were stuck between this world and the next. I don't know. Maybe they've seen my truck hundreds of times out here late at night over the years, and now I'm able to pick up on whatever it happens to come through here. Who knows? Anyway, that's my experience with the paranormal. Hopefully, it will be my last. I've had a few Bigfoot encounters in my time as a ranger, all of them while I've worked in Oregon State. My first encounter was while I was working the day shift in one of our more popular parks. It's a park that draws many visitors in high numbers due to its close proximity to Portland, Oregon. One chilly February morning, after my first tour group had returned from their hike, I was cleaning up the back rooms right when I heard something slam against the exterior of one of the buildings nearby. It was a very odd noise, kind of like something hitting hard against the walls, only heavier. Something that felt very large and heavy had just slammed. I grew increasingly concerned. Pulling out my sidearm, I went to go investigate. That's when I saw the creature, standing not even 50 yards away from me, standing there in broad daylight, completely concealed by the trees. I had never been a believer in the paranormal or Bigfoot, but mind you, this changed all of that. Standing directly in front of me was a creature that I was always convinced was myth and legend. I can wholly state that I was never a believer until that very moment. It stood almost 8 feet tall, covered with dark brown hair, and some sort of strips around its wrists and legs. Most striking, though, were its eyes. They looked almost human. They were pitch black, dead, like a shark's. I'll never forget that. The creature stood its ground and stared into my soul for a couple of seconds. I somehow got lost in its gaze. Then, it turned away from me and went back into the forest which it had come from. After it had disappeared, I was in complete and utter shock. I didn't know what to do or who I could talk to about this. I sure as heck was not going to tell my boss. I mean, that's just asking to get fired. If I straight up told them I saw Bigfoot, they'd send me to the loony bin. So I just kept that sighting to myself for a very long time. Then again, a month later, I saw a similar creature in appearance walking up a hill in the distance. This was in the late afternoon. It looked to be the same creature that I had seen only 5 weeks before. I did not get a good look though, but it looked to be the same height and body structure. It was definitely a Bigfoot. I had no doubt in my mind that this was the exact same creature. I've heard of other people having sightings right there where they work in Oregon State, including one coworker who saw one right by his patrol car on the side of the road while he was driving. But these incidents have never been treated seriously by park managers or anybody else in charge because none of us have ever had any actual proof. A few years later, I found out that another coworker of mine, while working at a different park, also had an encounter with the same creature, within walking distance from where I had seen it, but he didn't have any kind of proof either. I still to this day don't understand how these creatures can stay hidden for so long, and continue to evade capture by rangers, police, and just regular outdoorsmen who hunt, carry guns whenever they go into the woods. Unfortunately, a lot of us government personnel are not allowed to talk about our experiences. If we do, they have to be in secrecy or in private with other civilians, or even amongst each other. I've even had trusted colleagues who have had their own terrifying stories with things far beyond what I've shared with you today, and they just shove it deep down. And don't tell a soul. Many of them are going to die with these experiences. There seems to be an unprecedented stigma around sharing these kinds of stories, don't you think? I've been a part of the search and rescue team for the state of Texas for about 6 months now. I've been on a lot of calls, but never really saw anything out of the ordinary, except some strange stuff here and there. I had just finished my patrol shift and was at home when we got a call about an officer down. The search was an area in Odessa, which is about 90 minutes away. So I had to drive about halfway there before getting on the phone with my supervisor. He gave me a rundown of what happened, and we discussed what our plan of action would be. The main idea was to wait in a choke point along the highway for somebody who might have been involved in the crime for an innocent person fleeing the scene. I had the idea of setting up a perimeter around that area and waiting for something or someone to come out, then follow it or them as they ran from the area. After 2 or so hours, we had not seen anybody leaving, so I suggested to my supervisor that we go ahead and head into town where this all happened, considering it was still dark. He agreed. After getting into town, we started searching around the area where the incidents happened. We had already searched most of the houses and businesses, but I saw a few places that might have been good hideouts for someone who was running from the scene. Off in the distance, there were a line of thick trees and brush leading out to an area not too far from the highway. In the past, criminals have tried to hide out in this area for safety before. I asked my supervisor if he wanted me to check the area, or we should wait until daybreak. He told me to go ahead and search around it, but to not go inside unless I had proper backup. I started off walking through the brush and into the woods, checking around every corner in case there was someone hiding. As I came upon a small clearing, I noticed that it had been stripped of all its leaves. There were clear signs of dragging marks on the ground as well. This seemed too coincidental, just for me to believe that this spot wasn't used by somebody. I stayed outside of the clearing, using it as a marker for my search area, and continued to walk deeper into the brush. I had been walking for about 5 minutes when I came upon an old tree that looked like it was struck by lightning pretty hard. It was split right in half, but not at the base. It was almost as if somebody had cut it with a chainsaw and left the bottom end intact for some reason unknown. I don't know how to describe it, but I felt this tree possessed this supernatural energy about it. In fact, the surrounding area where I was felt different, higher in electromagnetic energy. I stood there for a while, trying to get over this feeling that kept growing stronger and stronger. I decided that taking pictures and documenting the area would help me get over this feeling. However, as I started taking pictures, I felt the blood in my veins freeze. There, between 2 trees, was this pale white hand reaching out from behind, pulling itself towards me. I didn't run or scream. I couldn't make a sound at all. It felt like time had stopped entirely, and everything around me had completely disappeared, except now for this figure standing before me. As it came closer to the light of day, its face now being visible, it looked as though somebody had stuck a light bulb inside of this thing's head. It was somewhat translucent, and had these 2 completely solid white eyes, with a swarm of black energy emanating around it. I was in complete shock. I could not feel my arms or legs. All I could do was stand there, staring at this thing coming towards me. The figure moved slowly, and as it got closer to me, it stopped moving and let out an exhale of hot air that smelled like fireflies mixed with spoiled meat. Then, it opened its mouth as if it were going to say something, but it did, and the clouds above us grew dark and began forming into what looked like this bright light that enveloped the figure before me, and everything returned to normal. Everything that was standing in front of me had vanished, and all there was left to see was some tree branches swaying back and forth from where this thing had just been. I felt as if the entire world had changed around me. Nothing made sense anymore, like a dream where you try to make sense of what's going on, but it always ends up not making any sense at all. The feeling of dread only grew stronger within me, so I decided to get out of there, head back before anything else eventful would happen. Running back out, I radioed my supervisor. When I got back, he asked if I had found anything, and I told him there were signs of animal or human activity, but nothing conclusive. He was disappointed by my findings, but told me to keep searching. Later on, we ran into a group of state troopers who wanted to keep the search going. They both said they saw something earlier that day that was not normal. They asked if I was up for helping them look. I said yes. Anyway, that's another story for another time. This email is already getting quite long, and perhaps I'll share with you that story in a follow-up email. For now, I'll leave you with this cliffhanger. Enjoy, my friend. I'm a national park ranger, in charge of finding missing persons, keeping trespassers out, and occasionally helping with wildlife protection. I've taken part in dozens of search and rescue missions, all throughout my career. I will share with you just a few mind-blowing experiences and encounters I had during my time working with nature. According to local legend, if you go to a certain wooded area at night, you will encounter what is known as the Lady of the Lake. While she's locked away in her watery grave, supposedly, the legend says that she could still get out, sometimes, always taking her victims with her. There have been supposed numerous reports of people being spotted, walking along a pathway into an area where there is nothing, only to disappear for good. Even more terrifying are those who have spotted the lady herself, a tall white figure in robes that floats freely through the forest. They say she is completely pale white. She is, after all, an apparition, one to be feared. This story happened during my first week on the job, when I was still getting used to it. It wasn't anything too out of the ordinary at first. Some had reported seeing some deer that were not native to our area, although there were several animals like that around here now. It was nothing too unusual, until we figured out that it wasn't just a deer. The woods were dark, and the night was getting colder as I found myself walking along a path in search of these animals. After some time, I heard something moving towards me through the trees. The sounds were low at first, but they became louder and more distinct until you could hear whatever it was leaping from one tree to another, like an animal, or perhaps not an animal. Something I could not identify. I couldn't see anything yet, even though my flashlight lit up the entire surrounding area. Whatever it was beyond my reach. I pulled out my pistol, turned off the safety. As far as guns go, this is usually one of those times when you don't actually want to keep it in your holster. I could just keep my fingers on the trigger. I would be okay. It brought me a sense of calm. The flashlight shook in my hand as I slowly moved it around, trying to get a better look for anything that might be moving towards me in the distance. Then, something fell from above onto me. It felt like a bag of bricks landing directly on top of me, even knocking the wind out of my lungs. For what seemed like an eternity, we kept struggling until we fell to the ground together. A pair of glowing purple eyes stared into mine before disappearing. Whatever this thing was, it was bipedal, and ran off like a human, despite its ape-like appearance. This strange creature jumped off of me, darting back into the trees. Of course, it wasn't purple in color, but the light of the moon cast a different color on this creature, making it seem different. It disappeared and I ran for my life, out of fear. I'll never forget that. I'm pretty sure what I had encountered was a juvenile Sasquatch that just so happened to fall on top of me from the tree that it was in. Right where I was at was under a thick canopy of foliage, trees, and leaves. I'm assuming it must have been clumsy and fell. I don't know, it was very strange. I've heard of other stories like that where supposedly juvenile Sasquatch are more careless, get caught out in the open, or make simple mistakes their adult counterparts would never make. I also heard about a fellow park ranger who disappeared while on duty one night. Apparently, he got lost in the woods after encountering a large ape-like creature that chased him, nearly killing him. When he was found, he described his assailant as a large ape-like man creature, a large body, long arms, and fur all over its body, with glowing eyes. I have no idea what happened to him, but from what I know, he managed to get away from this creature. Now, I never found much other details about the White Lady, or whatever it's called, but instead ended up encountering that juvenile Sasquatch. I was patrolling the Witch's Cavern in Texas, going from one tourist attraction to the other while in the cavern, or spots that tourists had deemed attractable. I had heard that there was a missing hiker, but I never expected anything like what I encountered that day. As I was leaving the cavern, it sounded like there was a terrified screaming coming from inside. I called out to make sure nobody was trapped. The more time I spent there looking for whomever might have been in the cavern with me, the more terrifying it seemed to be getting. I kept hearing these terrible screams, and they did not sound human. It sounded like something you'd hear out of a horror movie. I'm not gonna lie, I felt extremely reluctant to continue my search for the missing hiker. But ultimately, I knew what I had to do. I had to keep looking. But I was definitely scared of what I might find inside the cave. Well, I never actually found the missing hiker. The screams, they never ceased. I'm still looking today, and it's been 20 years. I never found out what was in the Witch's Cavern. I could go on a tangent, claim that it was some sort of ghost or, I don't know, maybe a skinwalker, some sort of other mythical creature that is supposedly said to exist. But I do not know for sure who or what was down there. Whatever it is, it's probably still there, since I seriously doubt it was a person. Perhaps we will never know what happened to that missing hiker. But I would advise any hikers or rangers out there to keep an eye out and always be aware of what your gut and senses tell you. Sorry this email is so short. I'm not great with words, but this was an experience that really haunted me. I thought you would enjoy it. This happened back in 1981. I was a park ranger in Texas at the time. Not my most favorite job in the world, but it paid well, at least for where I was in my life. And I got to be outside in nature, something my younger self really enjoyed. The location where I was at was remote enough. I didn't see too many visitors myself, so my work was pretty quiet. I wasn't sure where it came from at first. I guess it just appeared out of nowhere one day, or maybe materialized, became visible, as if stepping into our dimension from another place. Taller than 6 feet, maybe 10 feet tall if that, while standing up straight on 2 legs with its head held up high. Set aside, what really unnerved me about this sighting of this creature that I saw, it was less like an ape, and more like the Grim Reaper's sadistic cousin. Pale, The face was almost human-like, but everything about this being was wrong, elongated and pale, very thin, skeletal, if you will. Most importantly, I didn't see any eyes. They were just two large black holes. That's what freaked me out. I'm sure you think nothing of it if you saw a person with eyes standing right in front of you. But then you take away the eyes and give it the appearance this creature had. Now it's a whole other thing. I didn't know exactly what to do when I saw it. My wits weren't quite quick enough to figure out how to react. As I was looking out in the night at this thing that had somehow materialized out of nowhere, I noticed it appeared to be going deeper into the forest, like it was destined to be somewhere. I ran over to my truck, grabbed my shotgun. I was already used to hunting rogue dogs and stuff, so this tool would be useful in any scenario. Sure enough, I followed after it. Probably a big mistake. But I guess at the time, despite its ghoulish and otherworldly appearance, my young age, I suspected it was probably just some druggie in a costume. I didn't know what it was. Now, it's been a while since I've been back there. But if you go back far enough, there's this old dilapidated abandoned house on the way on the secluded trail. Few people ever walk on it. It seems like it's always a hot spot for the right teenagers, looking to do some things in private, when they can maybe sneak off the trail in private. Anyway, from what I understand, even people have reported on this trail before, which is just hearsay, mind you, weird things. I don't know what that pertains, but it's just hearsay. So I tracked this thing the best I could, but after some time, I wasn't seeing any imprints in the ground, or any real viable way to track it. This wasn't like an animal that I could have brought a bloodhound with and tracked its scent. This was completely otherworldly in nature. It was like it wasn't even physically here. Well, eventually, I lost sight of this thing, and ended up coming across several dead animals in my path, all of which appeared to have just dropped dead. This completely disturbed me down to my very core. I knew already that I could never tell anybody about what I had witnessed, for fear of my career. They would have suspected I was taking something. I know this story probably sounds false, but hear me out. If you've ever been to the Crater Lake National Park in southern Oregon, you've probably come across some strange UFO-esque type things. Maybe you've heard of Bigfoot. Maybe you've heard of strange lights and UFOs. Either way, a friend of mine, or whom I'll call a friend, had apparently seen a mysterious creature back in the year 2000 while on duty, alone, during night patrol. Now, I'd asked him to tell me what exactly he saw that night, but it took a lot out of me to get him to talk about it. He kept saying, "No one's going to believe me," and he's been like that ever since his encounter 21 years ago. After some begging, pleading, and more bribing, this friend of mine, who I've worked on the field with many times and is a very honest man, finally opened up about seeing this strange, monstrous beast, as he described it. All he remembers is it having huge teeth, large dark eyes, and said its hair scared him. He said that the claws of this thing were so long, and it stood at least 8 to 9 feet tall. It was also hairless for the most part. He said it was white, very pale looking. Now, this particular ranger said this creature stared into his eyes for a solid few seconds before walking off into the woods. Whatever it did, it didn't just stare into his eyes. He explained it as this thing, whatever it was, penetrated his very soul. It's as if this thing had just vanished and disappeared quickly. He had asked me if I believe his terrifying encounter. I mean, I said yes. While getting him to share it with me, the man nearly broke down. He was very distraught while telling the story. Who else could possibly say that and make that up at the same time? He's certainly not the actor type. If so, what other rangers or anyone who's been in the woods experienced that would be something like the X-Files. I'm a National Parks Ranger. Let me tell you that these guys have some of the best, creepiest, and completely unexplainable stories you'll ever hear. Some of them have been in the game for decades, and they should honestly pitch some of their stories to Netflix or something. Regular Joes would never believe me. I mean, if you heard some of the things we came across, just on regular routine patrols and driving around. The particular park we look after is huge. I mean, absolutely massive. Miles and miles, and well, you get the picture. We knew that there were old shacks and houses on the land. And when I say houses, I mean more like something from the frontier times, or one of these off-grid types. We've never actually come across one where somebody still lives in it. I guess the days of just making a home wherever you laid your hat on are long gone. And oftentimes, when we would come across one, it would have been left to wreck and ruin. Usually not much remains other than some rotting wood, and a few reminders that a person at one point or another used to live here before animals have moved in and taken over. However, this one time, we came across something that was more than a little weird. We'd been on an overnight to get as far out as we could onto this piece of land. Like I said, you could drive for hours and not come close to seeing anything at all, except forest, trees, and, surprisingly, more forest. Some areas were so thickly overgrown, it was impossible to get back there. But we were doing some research on the different birds found in the area, which required us to cover as much ground as possible. That was when we came across the hut. Now, it isn't wholly unusual to find these, but as I said, they're usually dilapidated. This one, however, although on the small side, looked to be in pretty decent condition, at least from the outside. The wooden structure looked old and weathered, but was still standing. We couldn't see any obvious holes where animals had gotten inside. I was with my buddy and colleague, Hunter, and we both jumped out of the truck to take a better look. There was an actual door to the structure, since it was completely overgrown all around with no obvious tracks beside our own. We summarized that there was nobody home, or at least had been for a long time. The door actually seemed to be locked, but age and weathering had warped it so the deadbolts up on the other side came away easy with just a few pushes. Upon entering the property, we were hit by the expected smell of rot and mildew, but not the usual animal feces and stink we were used to. There were no windows, so we just used our flashlights, finding some old lamps that the owner must have had when things got dark. Aside from being shut up for God knows how long, the place was surprisingly tidy. Whoever had lived here had been house-proud. It might have been a small hut in the woods, but everything seemed to have a place. Dishes were stacked on shelves, the tiny sink empty. The bed in the corner was even made. Clothes and blankets folded neatly close by. There was even a small table laid for dinner, except for all the cobwebs and dust. The place, for the most part, was spotless. We did notice some scratches, and a mess by the door which seemed strange compared to the rest of the interior. But that was soon solved when we discovered a canine skeleton at the end of the bed. Whoever this place had belonged to had left the dog inside when they just up and left. I say skeleton, but it was clearly a dog that was mummified, and not much left of it. That really got to me, being an animal lover. But there was something else too, although I couldn't quite put my finger on it, yet. My initial thought was perhaps the person had been out hunting, maybe had an accident, been hurt, or unable to get help, and never returned. Hunter wondered if they simply wandered off into the woods and killed themselves. However, we both then noted a single shotgun mounted on the wall. Then I noticed something else. The small table was indeed laid with plates and cutlery for 2 people. Did the dog join him at the table? We weren't concerned about it being any sort of crime scene after all this time, so we removed the shotgun to take back with us. We do some digging on the off chance it might be registered. There was nothing else in there to help with any identification or value to return to any family members. That is, if we ever worked out who'd actually been there. We were just closing the door back up when suddenly, the thing that had been looking us in the face, the thing that had been gnawing at me, making me question this particular hut over all the others, became apparent, like a light bulb going off. It was locked from the inside. There were no windows. It wasn't really big enough for a second entrance. And there was one way in and out, all having been locked, which was massively atypical in itself. This small hut, but incredibly neat hut, which barely enough room for 1 person, had a tiny table set for 2, had been locked from the inside with no other way out, and yet the only bones were those of a small dog. We took the gun back to base, did a ton of research, but never found out who had lived there, never resolved any of the mystery of what happened to them, or how the door had seemingly locked itself, or of course, how the owner just managed to vanish out of thin air. I've been a ranger now for a few years, and before I started my job, I would have never believed the unexplainable that goes on and, you kind of just randomly come across when patrolling. The place I work out of is pretty busy most of the year, with hikers, campers, scouts, etc. So, we're required to be vigilant about keeping safe. After all, it is a part of the job. However, there is a decent-sized team, and we are very proactive at checking the site for any potential dangers, making sure there aren't any nasty surprises for the kids, especially to come across. They might be wilderness scouts, but nature can be pretty gross, and a decapitated Bambi can give a young child PTSD. Anyway, on this particular day, we had a bunch of junior high kids due later in the week. We wanted to give the area a full sweep. We don't Disney-fy the woods or anything. It's still very much nature, but you don't want 12-year-olds falling down ravines or getting caught in an unseen spider's nest. We want them to enjoy their outdoors adventures, to not be scared or scarred for life. Literally. There had actually been a report left by a hiker, no name or contact, stating they'd seen something odd out on trail marker 113. Maybe somebody should check it out. So off I headed, wondering just what this odd thing could be. Maybe marker 113 was quite a way out. The hiker must have been training for some expedition or something. We don't get an awful lot of people up that way, and I've seen a few odd things during my time in this job. One of the most disturbing was a stag's head nailed to a tree. We do have permits for hunting at certain times when we designate certain areas out of bounds to anybody else, but that had happened during an off-season, and it was messed up. We never did find the body, or saw anybody sneaking out a huge carcass. Whatever I had been expecting to find that the hiker had found odd enough to report, it sure wasn't this. At the very far point of the marker, making it a good few-hour trek from the base on foot, was what I thought at first was a body. Thankfully, as I rushed over, I saw that there was no actual body, just clothing laid out on the floor. A sweater, ladies' pants, and boots. When I moved them carefully, underneath was a bra and panties. Even socks placed inside the boots. And this wasn't old or thrift store stuff either. It appeared to be expensive designer labels. I was looking at several $100s worth of clothing. It also appeared very new and clean. I also noticed how completely silent it was. Like, not quiet. I could actually hear myself breathing. There was no wind, no rustling, no animals scuttering about or insects. Nada. So I took some photos on my cell phone and nearly soiled myself when I heard this creaking sound, like a branch or something heavy moving. I reacted quickly and saw what I thought was another body hanging from one tree beside me. But again, it wasn't a person. This time, it was clothes, very similar in style. They had been sewn together and strung from a branch on the tree. Around the neck of the sweater was a rope, which had also been sewn to the material to give the appearance of a body having been hung. And again, it was the exact same clothing, all very designer-based, expensive and new. And this time, though, there was another difference, one I only noticed as I really scrutinized the clothing. There was blood on the cuff of the sweater. I ended up calling one of the bosses. They ended up involving the cops just in case. The clothes and area were all tested for DNA. There were no hits. They were able to determine, however, that the blood had come from a female, but that was about it. No one could actually remember speaking to or seeing any person that left the comment. The page was tested again, but no joy. One of our regular power hikers had passed that way 3 days before and hadn't noticed anything unusual, see or smell. The clothing was indeed designer and expensive, like I had thought, but could also be found in any high-end department store. No women fitting the description of the clothing had been reported missing at any given time. We will likely never know what had happened. Maybe it was an elaborate prank, but why? Maybe somebody shooting a movie. But again, why leave all the expensive props? Maybe there really was a serial killer out there. I mean, after all, it was identified as real blood. But again, none of it makes sense. Thank God, though, there was actually no dead bodies. One theory I heard was that twins were out there to die as a murder-suicide pact, and once they were dead, their bodies were abducted by aliens. As nutty as that sounds, could it really explain the disappearance of bodies and why it was so quiet? Not as much as a fly was around that area, and they usually swarm to even the drop of blood or decay. But why would the hanging outfit be sewn together? Why were the clothes new? And where was the body? Regardless of what actually happened, that area is now strictly out of bounds, even to the majority of rangers. No civilians are allowed, and only those of us rangers with special clearance are actually able to patrol and check the site. I've been back a few times, and thank God nothing else has ever been discovered. Every time I'm there, though, I still get this really uneasy feeling, and that silence still freaks me out. I was working as a forest ranger up here in Anchorage when this happened. My job at the time was to patrol the remote areas of the park, make sure nobody ever lit fires they weren't supposed to, or throw litter when they weren't supposed to. I was equipped with my own radio and rifle with me at all times, in case I had to deal with any squatters or crazy people who came in the woods looking to do bad things, or maybe camping out at night illegally when they weren't supposed to. It was just before midnight on a Friday evening. I had been patrolling an area called Barney Creek. I hadn't noticed anything unusual happening, so I wasn't expecting anything like that later that night. But then I found a deceased person, a skeleton. More on that in just a second. On my way back to my car is when I saw this body lying across the trail that I'd been walking on. At first, I thought it was maybe an animal. This is due to the condition that the body was in. But as I got closer and looked again, I realized it wasn't a bear corpse or any other animal. This is because there was no fur covering its flesh. It had obviously died for quite a while ago. After shining my flashlight around the area more thoroughly, with a sense of growing apprehension, tapping into whatever bravery might be needed, I slowly approached the remains, took out my camera before beginning to take pictures of the evidence. I was in no way prepared for what I saw when I moved much closer to take a look. The skull. It was pretty badly rotted, and there appeared to be a bullet hole right behind the left eye socket. Some brutal execution must have also happened, maybe even torture, judging by how bony and ripped out their chest area looked, without flesh, or what was left, covering up the ribcage. Whoever they were, somebody wanted them dead, and couldn't accept any opposition from whoever they were going after. This meant that whoever killed them was still around, and they'd be coming back. They could have been waiting out for me in the forest, possibly planning to take out their sick revenge on me. I had one mission: to get out of there as soon as possible and alert the authorities for backup. I had to run back as fast as I could, which was hard with how freaked out and terrified I was, still getting lost and occasionally trying to remember. Every time a branch or leaf would brush against me, I just suspected it was something that could kill me now, kind of like a monster's claw reaching up from behind bushes, ready to grab me by the neck and snap it like a twig. My heart raced with so much fear that I swear it was almost going to pop out of my chest without any warning at all. Finally, after what seemed like forever, I managed then to get away, but just collapsed onto the forest floor, completely exhausted. As soon as morning had arrived, I was successful in returning to the area, but the remains were gone. I couldn't tell if somebody had come in and taken them, or maybe some animal decided to bury their body under some dirt or leaves until fully decomposed. In any case, it didn't matter much because no one was going to find out who killed that person. But I realized afterwards, whoever did it might have been looking for me too. It's best not to say anything about my experience now while I'm still working as a ranger. Look, I don't know what happened, but here in Alaska at night, those skeletal remains still haunt me. I have never seen a cadaver in that bad a condition. But all I can say is, why didn't everybody just stay away from this area? Why did this happen? Who was this poor soul that got killed? It definitely looked malicious, like somebody had just left the body there. I mean, that's kind of obvious. Had it been an animal, it would have been eaten on, torn apart. But the body had been there for a while, and there were no signs of any animals even touching it. How strange. Almost paranormal, if you will. I am a 20-year veteran in the Forest Service. I've worked as a ranger now for 12 years in my time. And in all my time working for the government, I've never encountered anything out of the ordinary. That is, until my last station job as a ranger at Gooseberry Falls State Park in Minnesota. It was quite possibly one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had while on duty, and certainly not something I'll ever forget. Well, to explain how it happened, we need to go back about 6 months. Before that incident, I had been planning on retiring. My son had just graduated college and was looking to move closer to Minneapolis. So, once he made the offer that he would work part-time with me while he looked for a full-time position, I decided to pass up retirement and stay on the job. By the way, I should make a note that this was all pre-COVID. I had heard rumors of management positions opening up in the area. So, after discussing it with him, we both agreed that he would come back home for around 6 months while I waited for the opportunity to present itself. I was first introduced to Gooseberry Falls State Park during my orientation as a ranger there, and they took us out into the park at nighttime. It was an amazing sight, getting to see all these bright campfires down below from way above on top of the waterfalls. The rocks around the falls are very smooth and slippery due to years and years of erosion. You have to be careful if you want to climb down to view the falls at night. Our group had just finished our tour and was going to head back towards our cars when one of my coworkers, Tom, suggested that we climb down the falls. Just, for the sake of it. I agreed, and we should have known better. And so did a handful of others who were nearby. As soon as we began climbing down, I sensed something wasn't right. But being fearless, I pushed those feelings aside as nothing more than nerves. It started out easy. Everyone traveling downward in a single file behind each other, staying close and yet far enough apart for safety's sake. Then, around 3/4 of the way down, things began to get a bit more dangerous. Tom fell. I didn't see him do it, but I heard the commotion. One of my other coworkers had seen what had happened, yelling up to us that he needed help getting Tom back up the rocks. 2 guys rushed down to assist in whatever way they could. And while Tom was being helped back up, one of my female friends called out for help above him, saying she was slipping. It turns out that one part of the path she had been walking, had gave way underneath and sent her tumbling downward. While this may have been scary in and of itself, what happened next could only be described as something straight from a horror movie. We're all standing there in shock at what had just happened when I heard the sound of movement. I looked up, and there, at the top of the ridge, was this figure with long dark hair watching me. It was terrifying. It was in all black and had these faint yellow glowing eyes. It was in that moment that I felt my entire body give way, as if I suddenly lost control. The next thing I knew, I too was falling down to the grounds below me. Everybody rushed over to help save me, and one guy managed to grab hold of my hand while another wrapped his arms around one leg, for whatever little good that did. They tried pulling me back up, but it was no use. I looked down below and I could see there were people trying to help my friend, though they weren't having much success. I knew then that we were all going to die right here on these rocks if somebody didn't do something fast. That's when I remember the park ranger telling us about one of the waterfalls in this area, called Lucifer Falls, which, for some reason, nobody had ever been able to find after climbing down to view it at night. It was said that once you get close enough, you could hear voices, supposedly spirits, whispering your name from below. Now, what is most troubling about this story is not so much what happened to me and my coworkers, but what happened with Tom and the female friend as they were being pulled back up to safety. Before either of them can make it out of the water completely, we noticed that their eyes had turned from their normal state into a solid black. It was like at this moment that my 2 coworkers realized that they were struggling with weren't actually Tom or the girl. I'll never forget hearing one of them scream as he pointed downwards towards whatever our friends had become. The other one, just before Tom and his girlfriend can pull themselves completely up onto the rocks, let go with both hands, jumping back down into the water below to avoid capture. We watched him swim off in the opposite direction, but by this time, there was nothing we could do to save him. We never did find out what happened to any of them after that day. I can only assume they were captured and are now being used for some sort of test subjects, for whatever their reasons may be. Just looking at my own hands now, I can still see the long dark hair growing them, like I saw that day. That's why I'm warning you all not to venture down this path at night. As a matter of fact, it might be best just to stay away from these woods entirely during nighttime hours, like we should have. Whatever it is that inhabits these lands does not seem too keen on having people wandering around here at night. But if you are, be careful, for you may soon find the woods themselves can't tell the difference between friend and foe. I suppose it is expected that anybody who chooses to follow in the footsteps of Smokey the Bear would be possibly stuck in a few scary situations. That certainly was the case for me, as I spent my nights working alongside park rangers on some of the most dangerous and terrifying trails in the States. It's not what one might think about being a ranger, though. We don't spend every day sitting around watching deer graze or children play in the playgrounds. Instead, what happens behind those locked gates is something more akin to horror movies than a picnic. If you manage to find your way through these wooded corridors without being eaten alive by some wild animal or eaten after a bear, you could end up with some serious psychological damage. As my first summer as a ranger was coming to an end, I decided that I wanted to spend one last night in the woods alone. Not many rangers do that kind of thing anymore, but for me, it was sort of this cleansing ritual. My girlfriend had just broken up with me at the time, and I needed time to work through that emotional trauma. I knew there were other people who understood my pain. They would be likely willing to talk about the world ending when we got close enough in proximity. But every man needs his space from time to time, even if he is working with the confines of the law. To be honest, I wasn't really sure where to expect to be out there in the woods with no one else around. I had been alone quite a few times before, but never running into any real trouble. But this time, my mind was racing through the worst-case scenarios, and it almost felt like fate that I would get caught up in some kind of adventure by myself. Either I was going to find somebody who could relate to all my situation, or perhaps even fall for them as they helped me through it all. Anyway, I made it to the trailhead, eventually, and began hiking down towards it to my favorite spot at Lake Oroville State Park. The entire park is beautiful, located not far from Sacramento. But until you are actually standing deep within its borders, you can't truly grasp its beauty. I loved watching the weather roll in over the water, feeling the cold air as it rushed past my face and into my lungs, waking me up from a lazy afternoon nap. I felt at peace with myself every time I visited this spot, but not so much that other people bothered me. That's why this was almost certainly going to be a good night. I just crossed over one of the small bridges leading across the lake when I heard something rustling behind me. More similar to low growls than anything else, really. It sounded like something was stalking towards me, perhaps a bear. The only thing about these sounds that didn't scream bear were its frequency. They were more sporadic than I would have expected. My ears picked up this distinct sound of footsteps, more than once actually, as if somebody were running towards me, directly through the thicket. Not wanting to meet with whatever was out there on my own terms, I scrambled for one of the trees and threw myself up into it to try and hide. Unfortunately, jumping back had cost me more time than I realized, and by the time that I reached around and grabbed hold of a branch, something hit me hard right in the side. You know, it feels like forever before I felt like landing against something soft and squishy. It wasn't exactly warm or inviting, so all of those other feelings must just be an illusion, brought on by adrenaline. It only took a single moment for me to realize what had been happening, that I had been wrapped at the ankles, waist, shoulders, and neck in some kind of netting. I didn't know what exactly it was made out of, but it wasn't rope. It was some sort of binding material. My hands were then completely immobilized by entanglement as well, so there wasn't much I could do other than struggle against my bonds. A dead-end endeavor, if there was ever one. Now, the first thing I noticed when I could finally see again is it was completely dark around me. All light coming from behind with only blackness ahead. 2 dim lights appeared along the walls on either side of me and began approaching slowly as my eyes would now adjust. They were really more like natural animal eyes than any sort of man-made illusions. Even worse, I noticed that the blackness ahead of me wasn't really coming from a lack of light at all. Instead, there appeared to be some kind of organic wall blocking out my view, spreading out across the room to each side. I had no idea how large this place was, but it must have been bigger than what I could see. One behind me and another in front of me. They made themselves known moments later. Footsteps. The noises were too far away for me to make out at first, but then I could hear they belonged to something, and more than two. Now at this point, fear began gripping my heart as I lashed out against my binds once again, only to find they hadn't been loosened in the slightest, or so I thought. We'll get to that in a moment. I was hauled from my small prison by several sets of long clawed hands that dragged over what appeared to be some kind of altar. It was much different from one of those sacrificial altars, appearing to be used in ancient times for rituals meant to appease unworldly beings who were said to lurk within the space between two worlds. But this one seemed more like a place where people got together for satanic worship or other unholy activities. These beings holding me lured me down onto it and began weaving this sort of flower all around me while chanting something in this ungodly language. I was so terrified, I swear I could have had a heart attack. I couldn't make out all the words, but I had no idea what this thing was or what they were saying. The entire group of these things began chanting in unison as they surrounded me, continued weaving more of this plant material around me. It felt like forever before they finally got to the last one. All I could do was just lay there on my back, completely immobilized by flowers, while these creatures circled around me once and turned their backs towards me. The chants stopped abruptly, and every creature but one turned to leave. The remaining one tossed this mask aside, revealing a set of devilish features underneath it. What I had been dealing with looked like a combination of wild feral human beings and kind of goblinish people. You know what it kind of reminded me of? The trolls or orcs in Lord of the Rings. Humanoid, feral looking, but also not human. That's what they reminded me of. It stood there, shaking its head from side to side, slowly with its arms raised upward as I tried to break free. Now, again, I cannot reiterate how terrifying this was. I had no idea what was going to happen, and I was convinced in that moment I was about to be sacrificed by some sort of under-cave dwelling creatures. I was so scared beyond belief. Then, this thing pulled its arm down, after shaking its head, and walked away. Completely immobilized, I tried my best to get out of my entrapment, and I believe it was the massive amounts of adrenaline exploding through my entire being that allowed me to break free. As I did, though, I could hear these things coming back, and I knew I had to escape as quick as I could. Once fully free, I started to run for it, escaping in just a matter of time, feeling my way out of this black organic labyrinth. I don't know if I was in a cave or what this was, but as I reflect back on these memories, I had so much flooding through my mind, I feel like I kind of blacked out. I don't really know if I remember much after that, but I do distinctly remember collapsing on the ground and being found later on. I know, that's probably very anticlimactic, but when the human body endures that kind of trauma, stress, it does things to the brain that aren't exactly normal. Anyway, I was treated at the hospital, ultimately taken back to the station, and sent home. I didn't actually believe what I had experienced at first. I thought it was some crude nightmare or horrible hallucination. But it wasn't until later that I realized it must have been something that really happened, because I actually had binding marks around my ankles, my thighs, my waist, and my wrists. Those bindings were on tight, and I must have wiggled free enough that I loosened them. Like I said, whatever the bindings were this crude rope vine material. I've never seen it before in my life. None of them really believed me, though, when I actually got a chance to describe what happened. They thought I was either making it up or just had a bad nightmare. As you can probably bet, this incident has been difficult for me. At any rate, this is my story, and I hope you can get enjoyment from a real-life traumatic event. I don't care if you believe me, and if you choose to read this, which, by the way, you have permission to, I don't care if your readers believe me. I know there's something out there that lives underneath the ground, something that isn't quite human. It was on a hot summer night that I was out in the dark woods with my neighbor, whom I'm pretty close with. He was like extended family, honestly. The fact that I didn't even know we were going until that night when I was sitting at home in front of my laptop, playing video games. My neighbor came over to see me, and he asked me if I wanted to go camping with him and his family. It had been a while since we last did anything together, so of course I said yes. It would have just given us an excuse not to go to school for a couple of days. This was in September, so school had just started back up, and the coldness of fall had not yet come, so it was perfect. The next day, his family and I gathered our camping gear. We're driving down a dark road with tall trees on either side of it. It was getting dark quickly, so we had to turn the lights on, and unfortunately, which means we would have had to set up in the dark. So we're driving for about an hour or two, but it felt like it took forever. My friend's dad turned left at an unmarked intersection, where there wasn't even a sign saying that this was the right turnoff. The road got bumpy and rocky as he drove over this very raw, unpaved road. That's when we came across a large clearing, because all I could see around me was trees and darkness, where we stopped at this makeshift campground. I say that because there was no clear indicated spot to set up a tent, a spigot, a bathroom, or anything. This was truly camping just out in the middle of nowhere. Perfect. Now, I need to say that it was pitch black out, and it had gotten really cold now that the sun had set. We were also higher up in elevation, so we got everything set up quickly and decided we would huddle up in the tent together that my friend's father had set up for us. But I just had this feeling lingering within me that we weren't alone. Now, my brain was playing tricks on me, so I decided to step out and get some fresh air. It was eerily quiet until I heard this screaming noise. My heart began pounding fast, as if it knew what was coming. Then we heard a rustling noise in the bushes, more screaming from the woods. I was so scared that my friend told me to come back into the tent now. Not only could we all hear the noises, but then, as I got back in the tent and we shined our light, we could see something moving outside the tent. This shape. My friend's dad got a flashlight, shining it too at this object. That's when this thing began screaming and thrashing. Now we're all yelling, freaking out because we can see the shape of this thing more. It looked like an animal, but all we could see was this large shape, and it was terrifying looking. From the silhouette, it looked like an upright, deformed reindeer or something, and it had long claws. Were we being pranked? I wasn't even sure. It screamed again in our direction, and we just prayed for it to leave. It walked around our tent, and we all kept our flashlights shining at it through the tent material, only revealing its silhouette. But one thing I noticed is it never came closer to the tent. It's like it was pissed that we set up camp here in its area. I get it. This probably sounds like some sort of amateur creepypasta, but tell that to my family, my friend's family, and me, who have to deal with the memory of this thing. We stopped hearing it, almost literally, after we all pretty much urinated all over our sleeping bags out of terror. Surprisingly, none of us had any weapons on us. Somehow we all forgot. We got lucky that night, but who knows what would have happened if it were to come back, and possibly check out our tent. Now, of course, my friend's dad regrets that he didn't bring any weapons. He forgot. He normally always carries a pistol. I went home the next day, and we didn't get any sleep that night. What was designed to be a several-day trip turned into a quick overnight terror. I've not been able to go camping since. I don't think I ever will. And I'm also not sure what this thing was or where it came out of. I haven't really sat down to try and research either. I don't really care. I just want to get rid of this memory. I had been working as a forest ranger for almost 5 years. A ranger's day could consist of anything from collecting firewood to tracking down missing hikers. And my day began like most. I would wake up early, walking into work, grabbing my binoculars. As I was about to drive out of the forest, I got a call. That day, I was given a new assignment. I met up with another colleague, a fellow ranger, and we went to the center of this area where somebody had been reporting hearing strange screaming coming from around a cave system nearby. My partner and me decided that I would be able to handle it by myself. He had other things to do, and this was just another run-of-the-mill investigation for me. After he left, I headed towards that area where there had been several unreported mouths to this cave system. Now, let me give you some information. This cave system runs pretty deep, and there are guided tours, but I also know that this cave system is very expansive, and also having a lot of unidentified entrances and holes that can lead deeper into the system. These are also off trail, so myself, I've never actually experienced finding more of these, although I know hikers have reported finding many, and even leaving makeshift markers to let other hikers know this was an entrance. Parts of the ground here were also dangerous, meaning if you step on the wrong part, the ground below you could collapse, falling into a tunnel. So I had to be very careful about how I approached this entire search. The good news is, I wasn't hearing any screaming, so that could be good or bad news. The bad news meaning the hiker or whoever was stuck there could have been deceased or what. But the good news being that maybe the hiker had gotten themselves out. Anyway, my heart was pounding just by the sheer adrenaline of it. I didn't know why, but something told me to run. It was this feeling in the pit of my gut. As soon as I got there, right around the cavern system, the wind picked up, and everything seemed colder than it already was. A gust. Now, I could have begun my investigation in the main entrance, but as I was planning, I heard the scream. It sounded like a person, but they were maybe a couple 100 feet away, north. So I marched through the trees, looking, following the source of the screaming, yelling out, "Can you hear me? Can you respond?" And the screaming ceased. I followed along the rock wall and found this crude hole in the ground, maybe no larger than 5 feet. It was right by a rotted tree stump with only one branch on it. This, I knew, probably went down into one of the cave systems. This, by the way, was probably no more than 200 feet away from the main entrance. After crouching down, I was able to slide down at a 45-degree angle into this cave system, landing in a small chamber that I think connected to the others. I always carry a flashlight with me, so I took it out and turned it on. As soon as I did that, the caves plunged into darkness as my battery instantly died. That's when I heard a loud crash. I turned around, or I should say, turned to meet the noise, and my flashlight popped back on. There, like out of some sort of sick Stephen King novel, was this grotesque figure, large black eyes covering its entire body, stretching its arms out and moving toward me. Terrified, I wanted to turn and run, but didn't have time, as there was another one of these beings coming from the opposite side of the cave, approaching. I turned as fast as I could and fled up the 45-degree incline about the cave. Just as I was turning to climb up, I could hear a third one approaching from directly behind me. Now I had one coming from my left, my right, and behind me. This one, as I turned and looked, was larger than the other two. Completely terrified out of my mind, and the sounds of screaming were now apparent, coming deeper in the cavern. I don't know if it was an injured hiker, or if these things were making the noise, luring anybody into this tiny crevice, this chamber into the earth. Like I said, the opening to this cavern wasn't large, but I never in a million years would have expected to find things like this. This was horror movie status. I didn't tell anybody else about what I found, and kept it to myself. After climbing out of that hole, I ran, and I ran, and I ran some more. Getting back to the station later on, I didn't say a word. I knew the other rangers wouldn't believe me. And what would I tell them? That I found a cave full of half arachnids, half creatures? I mean, they'd probably think I was crazy. Now, I've kept this secret for a while, but how long can I keep it from the rest of the world? Will my story ever be told to other people? Or should I just stay quiet about what had happened? Let me just apologize and say, I'm sorry for the formatting of this story. I'm a terrible writer, and I am not a storyteller, so I'd apologize in advance. But these creatures that I saw were unlike anything I've ever seen. They really reminded me if you crossed a tarantula with a human. I mean, these were gross. They made this hissing, clicking noise too. I know it sounds phony through email, but it's really hard for me to convey emotion properly, at least through written communication. With all the information coming out anymore about missing hikers and seeing strange figures and shapes in the woods, and all the other bizarre happenings of 2020, I figured, hey, maybe now is an okay time to be open about my experiences, and hopefully not experience backlash. I was patrolling my usual forest trails at night. I've been a ranger for 8 years now, and nothing had ever scared me as much as this one experience that I encountered, well, what I think was a Bigfoot, doing my routine patrol on this night. It all started with me, walking along the same trail I do at night to do my rounds. Being Florida, it had rained earlier in the day, so everything was calm and peaceful, minus the puddles of mud here and there. The sun had set about an hour or two before, which meant it was exceptionally dark outside, although I was already used to this. The moon was barely out. I saw a few other rangers patrolling with me, but they had passed by, and somewhere out of nowhere, maybe about 30 minutes later, I was walking along the dirt trail when I noticed something appeared in front of me. A dark, large figure coming from the right side of the path and then crossing in front of me as it headed off into some thick brush off to my left. Palmettos, actually. This is directly where I patrol, meaning there should most definitely not be anything even remotely close to resembling whatever this thing was. Its speed is what surprised me and took me off guard, considering it didn't even give me enough time to turn around and see what it looked like. All I could make out was that it was jet black, very tall, and easily taller than I was. It moved quickly. I didn't even have time to react until after it had already gone into the bushes, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared, deep in the palmettos. My heart sunk, and I felt an odd sensation. It was this incredible feeling of fear. All I can think about is how much more dangerous it had just made my job that night. If there was some large animal out here that moved fast, was taller than I and larger than I, that actually crossed paths with me like it did. What else might be lurking out here? Would it cross paths with me again? Was this thing actually looking for me? As I thought about it more, I considered the fact that if something was after me, then maybe whatever it was might be prepared to attack. Although I wasn't going to back down without a fight. I began getting angry. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. But I was a few hours away from my shift ending and talking myself into returning to the station, telling myself that if I did, I would be safe. If this thing is out there, it's just as much looking for me as it is anybody else. So now more than ever, getting to my ranger station was my only priority. I didn't really know what it was or what to think about it, but there was only one way to find out, and that was by continuing my patrol. Now I stood still for a moment, debating with myself on whether or not I should continue. Remembering all the times going back home early had made me feel like a failure. Although I had never encountered anything like this before, it didn't mean there was nothing out there. It only means that whatever it was hadn't bothered me yet. But now that it had crossed paths with me, I might be next on this list of things to kill. That would have made me sick. The rest of my story is pretty uneventful. Unfortunately, after this, not a lot happened. I didn't see the figure again, and as I look back on this event and reflect, I believe I encountered a skunk ape, a Bigfoot, native to the Florida Everglades. While it was probably harmless and didn't want to actually hurt or kill me, it was still completely terrifying. I still don't know if this creature was real or not, but that didn't matter, regardless of what it actually is. I'm convinced that whatever it was, it wanted to hurt me, or so I had convinced myself, and still wonder. I honestly don't know how to explain what had happened to me. I believe I saw some sort of Native American entity. I was working as a ranger for the city of Austin, Texas. I just had one left of our reserve campsites when a very strange thing occurred. This was about 10:30 at night. I was driving my four-wheel drive pickup truck on a dirt road that led back to the entrance of the park. The area is a wooded hillside spanning 200 acres and contains a very large number of wildlife. So, being nighttime and how many animals are nocturnal, I was watching out for signs of their movement on either side of me. It was quiet, and I was the only one around. I had been following the road closely when I got this strong sensation. The road, everything around it, dense woods. I looked up just as a deer ran out in front of my truck, directly in my path. It was something like 40 yards ahead of me. When I saw it, I reacted immediately by pulling onto the shoulder, slamming my brakes. The deer now was only about 10 feet away from my truck when I swerved and it vanished. As soon as it went out of sight, the feeling that had told me to look up subsided. Everything went back to normal. There were no other cars on the road. Of course, being just mine, I sat in place, trying to collect my bearings. My heart was beating fast and I had a headache, and I couldn't explain these feelings. What on earth? So something brought my attention to the hillside, right where the deer had come from, and that's when I saw movement, about 50 yards into the brush. It wasn't clear. I got out of my truck to inspect and walked up to the spot where I thought I had seen the movement through the tree line. The woods were pretty thick, but about 20 feet into them, there was a small opening and trees with lower branches and ones that were not as wide or tall. They almost kind of formed a natural corridor that maybe, I'd say, 50 yards opened up to the hillside before becoming obscured by the other trees and foliage. The ground sloped slightly upward, many leaves. I called out with my flashlight, thinking, why would there be somebody out here? It didn't make any sense. Thinking maybe I was just seeing things, or it might be another deer. There was no answer, and that was it. I assumed it was just my own paranoia. Now, I didn't hear anything move past me, so I decided to inspect further, because why not? Calling out loudly, I knew, at least I'm pretty sure, I saw movement. And again, there should be no reason at all why anybody should be this far out here late at night. The movement I saw was more like a person, not a deer. At least I'm sure of it. So I kind of very shortly walked up the hillside, never hearing a sound. I decided finally that okay, enough is enough. I'm going to leave and head back to my truck. As soon as I got in, I realized there was something wrong. Something strange and paranormal, if you will. As soon as I got back in my truck is when I saw it. Coming out of the woods ahead of me, slightly up from where the deer emerged, is what I can only unmistakably describe as an apparition. It was this glowing, translucent being, but unmistakably a spirit. It shimmered, seeming to be faint but nearly transparent. It came closer to my truck and appeared as if it were getting bigger, but also darker and more solid at the same time. It was this light grayish color and then would grow darker in color, kind of pulsating. It just walked right past the front of my truck, with no fear or concern about my presence whatsoever. It just walked by like nothing was there, with some kind of purposeful stride, without having so much as even a look of curiosity. And then, right there in my view, it just vanished, fading into obscurity. Not wasting a second, I flew my vehicle out of there, and my only mission in that moment was to go, 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 go. Before this, I thought ghosts were a joke. I had never been a believer in the paranormal, or what many refer to as the spirit realm. But after this, that changed my mind. And I'll never forget what I saw, but it wasn't until the following morning when I really kind of fully mentally processed what I saw. Surprisingly, because I didn't sleep that much. But a thought occurred to me, and I realized what had really happened. What I saw looked like a stereotypical image of a native. Long hair, down to its shoulders. Feathers, a headdress actually. My professional theory is that somebody, a Native American, has gone through this road many times before in their lifetime, and they're simply showing me something that happened here at some point along the way. Maybe they stumbled upon these woods at night, and for whatever reason, they were killed on spot by first contact European settlers, who probably had no qualms about killing anybody different than them, including women and children. I do not believe this entity or spirit to have been malicious. It didn't come off as that. It was just something that happened to them in their lifetime. This spirit was merely doing whatever some non-physical thing does when in the process of trying to relive what happened. It's a possibility that this spot is where these people might have killed or injured in an altercation. Maybe they were stuck between this world and the next. I don't know. Maybe they've seen my truck hundreds of times out here late at night over the years, and now I'm able to pick up on whatever it happens to come through here. Who knows? Anyway, that's my experience with the paranormal. Hopefully, it will be my last.